On 26 November 1943, over the skies near Bremen, Major Francis Gabby Gabreski made a brief but significant entry in his flight log after returning to base. Only months earlier, many seasoned Allied pilots, especially in the RAF, had doubted whether the large and heavy Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could hold its own against agile German interceptors. That day's mission proved otherwise. Gabreski noted that German pilots would soon learn to dread high-speed diving attacks, a tactic the Americans had refined into a decisive advantage. At roughly 28,000 feet, Gabreski had watched his unit execute a maneuver that broke from earlier fighter doctrine rooted in First World War tactics. Instead of engaging in tight horizontal turns, his pilots inverted and dropped almost vertically, accelerating toward speeds near 500 miles per hour. Few aircraft in the European theater could withstand such forces in a controlled descent. The P-47, however, was built to endure that stress and convert it into offensive momentum. German Messerschmitt Bf 110 seconds climbing toward formations of B-17 bombers did not anticipate danger from directly above. Within seconds, Thunderbolts appeared from the sun and opened fire with their 850 caliber machine guns, delivering concentrated bursts into the heavier German fighters. The combination of altitude, speed, and surprise shifted the balance of aerial combat. Superiority was no longer defined solely by turning performance or climb rate, but by the ability to dive at extreme velocity and then regain altitude using stored kinetic energy. Once back at higher levels where thinner air and turbocharged engines favored them, American pilots regained control of the engagement. Gabreski downed 2 Bf 110 seconds during that mission and received the Distinguished Service Cross for protecting the bomber formation. His success reflected a broader shift that had begun months earlier. On 13 April 1943, the 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat sortie, sweeping over northern France. Although the pilots had trained extensively on the P-47, many still questioned whether such a large aircraft could compete with German fighters in combat. Fully loaded, the Thunderbolt weighed far more than most single-engine fighters of the time. It exceeded the mass of the Supermarine Spitfire by several thousand pounds and was heavier than the Focke-Wulf W190 as well. Critics mocked its bulk, giving it nicknames that suggested clumsiness. Some RAF pilots who had defended Britain in lighter aircraft doubted that a machine of this size could survive against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Among the uncertain was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a newly trained pilot who feared his first weeks in combat might also be his last. His later memoirs would describe how perceptions of the P-47 changed dramatically once its strengths were understood. The aircraft itself originated at Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, New York. Engineer Alexander Kartveli designed a fighter unlike any before it, centering the airframe around the powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. With 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, the engine produced roughly 2,000 horsepower under normal conditions and even more with water injection for combat. Later variants achieved significantly higher outputs. A key element of the design was its turbo supercharger system, located deep in the fuselage. Exhaust gases traveled through long ducts to drive a turbine mounted toward the rear, compressing incoming air and maintaining engine performance at high altitude. This system allowed the Thunderbolt to deliver peak power around 27,000 feet and remain effective even higher, where many other fighters struggled. Its service ceiling exceeded 40,000 feet, placing it above most German interceptors, yet these capabilities came at the cost of weight. Heavy armor protected the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks carried substantial fuel, and 8 heavy machine guns with thousands of rounds added further mass. The aircraft's empty weight approached 10,000 pounds, and combat loads pushed it far higher. Many observers assumed such a machine would be too cumbersome in a dogfight. Early missions in the spring of 1943 were cautious. Pilots conducted sweeps along the coast, becoming familiar with equipment and terrain while avoiding unnecessary risk. The first major test came on 12 June 1943 during an operation over the Belgian coast. Captain Walter V. Cook spotted an FW-190 below and, following instructions to exploit altitude, dove from above. His burst of fire sent the German fighter spiraling down. It was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed victory and demonstrated the effectiveness of the diving attack method. The following day brought additional successes. Lieutenant Johnson scored his first kill by descending from higher altitude onto another Fu-190 near the French coast. The German pilot never realized he was being targeted until it was too late. These early engagements confirmed that the Thunderbolt's size and weight were not liabilities when used correctly. By leveraging altitude, speed, and durability, its pilots reshaped air combat tactics in Europe and turned skepticism into confidence. When Johnson touched down after the mission, Major General Carl Spaatz of the 8th Air Force greeted him personally and handed him a bottle of scotch, a symbolic reward for being among the first pilots in the unit to score victories in the newly introduced P-47. Yet the day also brought a sobering reminder of combat reality. During the engagement, Johnson's element leader failed to stay in position to cover him, leaving him alone against several German fighters. Although his victory was officially credited, he was reprimanded by senior officers, including ace pilots such as Francis Gabreski and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation. The incident underscored a lesson that would shape later operations. In aerial warfare, coordination and mutual protection outweighed individual achievements. Diving attacks had to be executed as a team. A successful kill meant little if a pilot failed to return. Even so, early combat sorties had not prepared Thunderbolt pilots for the dangers that would emerge during high-altitude trials back in the United States. Months before the 56th Fighter Group deployed to Britain on November 13, 1942, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer conducted performance tests with P-47C aircraft at altitude. Beginning dives from roughly 35,000 feet, they pushed their aircraft into near vertical descents. Their airspeed indicators surged past 500 miles per hour, then 600, and eventually showed an astonishing 725 m5 indicated airspeed. In reality, the true speed was likely closer to 550-600 m/, since instruments of the era became unreliable at extreme altitude and velocity. Republic Aviation later suggested that these dives may have briefly carried the aircraft beyond the speed of sound, potentially making the pilots the first humans to do so. Many aviation specialists challenged that assertion, and General Henry Hap Arnold reportedly instructed the company to stop promoting the claim. Post-war evaluations determined that the fastest confirmed Mach number reached by any propeller-driven fighter of the Second World War was around Mach 0.92, achieved in modified test aircraft such as a specially prepared Spitfire. The Thunderbolt probably never exceeded that threshold. Still, what Comstock and Dyer encountered during their dives would prove invaluable. At indicated speeds above roughly 550 mph, both pilots ran into severe compressibility. As airflow over parts of the wings approached transonic speeds, the controls stiffened dramatically and then seemed to freeze. Their aircraft plunged almost straight downward, accelerating continuously while normal control inputs produced no response. Both men experienced intense G-forces and narrowing vision as they struggled to recover. Despite the terror of those moments, they eventually managed to regain control, and their experience led to the development of standard recovery procedures for all P-47 pilots. The method they described required steady, forceful pressure on the control stick using both hands, while leaving the trim tabs centered and untouched. Pilots were warned not to adjust trim during such dives because once the aircraft reached denser air and responsiveness returned, overcorrection could occur instantly and violently. The correct approach was to maintain firm but controlled input as the aircraft descended. As altitude decreased, often below about 15,000 feet, the compressibility effects eased and the elevators gradually began to respond again, allowing the pilot to complete the recovery. Both Comstock and Dyer leveled out with less than 2,000 feet remaining, enduring forces exceeding 7 or 8 Gs before regaining stable flight. After landing and reporting their findings, engineers at Republic and military test centers moved quickly to incorporate the lessons. Training programs were updated so every Thunderbolt pilot would recognize the onset of compressibility and know how to survive it. Engineers also realized that the P-47's thick wing, often criticized for limiting maneuverability, actually delayed the onset of dangerous compressibility compared with thinner-winged fighters. This characteristic meant the Thunderbolt could dive at higher speeds and recover more predictably than many of its contemporaries. Later versions, especially the P-47D, included dedicated dive recovery flaps to help manage high-speed descents and improve control during recovery. In combat, this capability would become a decisive advantage. By the spring of 1943, Colonel Hubert Zemke drilled his pilots intensively in tactics designed around the aircraft's strengths. Pilots were instructed to climb to 30,000 feet or higher before reaching hostile territory and to maintain disciplined formation for mutual protection. They were told not to pursue enemy fighters down to low altitude, where the Thunderbolt's turning performance and acceleration were less competitive. Instead, if enemy aircraft appeared below, pilots were to roll inverted, pull several Gs to aim downward, and dive at full power. The resulting speed, often well above 480 mph, and sometimes surpassing 500, made interception or evasion extremely difficult for German fighters. In the attack, a Thunderbolt pilot would fire a short burst from 850 caliber machine guns, each firing at roughly 800 rounds per minute. Combined, this produced an immense volume of fire, more than 100 rounds every second. Even a brief 2-second burst at high closing speed could inflict catastrophic damage. After firing, the pilot would pull back firmly, convert the accumulated speed into altitude, and climb away from the fight, usually regaining a height advantage within a minute. Despite these emerging tactics, skepticism lingered. Some pilots were reluctant to abandon traditional dogfighting methods that emphasized turning battles. To them, disengaging in a high-speed dive seemed less like fighting and more like retreat. On June 26, 1943, while escorting B-17 bombers returning from a mission over France, 48 P-47Cs of the 56th Fighter Group encountered 16 Focke-Wulf W-192s from a German fighter wing near the French coast. The clash that followed proved both costly and instructive, reinforcing the need for strict discipline and the careful application of the Thunderbolt's high-speed dive tactics. Early in the engagement, Lieutenant Johnson's P-47C, known by the nickname Half Pint, was struck by several 20mm cannon rounds. The hits shattered the canopy, ruptured hydraulic lines that sprayed fluid across the windshield, and briefly ignited a fire inside the cockpit. Fragments from exploding shells also wounded Johnson in the nose, leaving him bleeding and partially dazed. Under normal circumstances, most pilots would have bailed out. Johnson couldn't. The damaged canopy refused to open, trapping him inside the crippled aircraft. With escape impossible, he lowered the nose and dove toward the English Channel at full speed. A pursuing W-190 closed in and continued firing into the already damaged fighter. More shells tore through the wings and fuselage. Eventually, the German pilot appeared to expend all ammunition. He then flew alongside the battered P-47, made eye contact with Johnson, offered a salute, and broke off. Whether it was a gesture of respect or simply recognition that the aircraft was finished as a target, Johnson never learned. Despite repeated hits, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine kept running. The aircraft's rugged design, heavy structural members, and redundant systems prevented it from breaking apart even after severe damage. Johnson managed to nurse the aircraft back across the channel and located RAF Manston, an emergency landing field. With his windscreen coated in hydraulic fluid and almost no forward visibility, he still performed a controlled landing. Ground crews later counted more than 200 holes from bullets and cannon shells without even walking fully around the aircraft. Structural components in the right wing were severed, the fuselage contained fist-sized openings, and the hydraulic system was completely destroyed. Johnson himself suffered only minor shrapnel wounds. Remarkably, the aircraft was repaired and returned to service. The mission, however, cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft and their pilots the worst single-day loss they had experienced to that point. It also highlighted the P-47's exceptional durability and its capacity to bring pilots home despite catastrophic damage. On August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg operation provided a major test of large-scale diving attack tactics. The 8th Air Force dispatched 376 heavy bombers in a coordinated strike against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft manufacturing plants at Regensburg deep inside Germany. Because the targets lay far beyond the effective range of most escort fighters, the bombers would eventually continue unprotected. P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group were tasked with escorting the Regensburg formation as far as their fuel allowed before returning to England. Major Francis Gabreski led elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioning his flights at about 30,000 feet, roughly 5.0 feet above the bomber stream. German fighters Bf-109 seconds and Fw-190 seconds began climbing from airfields across northern France and Belgium. Roughly 40 aircraft formed up, intending to intercept the bombers when the P-47 escorts would be nearing the limit of their range. What they did not anticipate was a coordinated attack from above. Several groups of P-47 seconds rolled inverted simultaneously, then entered steep dives between roughly 45 and 60 degrees. They accelerated rapidly, reaching speeds unfamiliar to German pilots accustomed to earlier American escort tactics. The battle lasted about 20 minutes and stretched across roughly 70 miles of airspace over Germany and Belgium. The P-47 pilots carried out repeated diving passes, striking at high speed before climbing back to altitude to reset for additional attacks. The 56th Fighter Group reported 16 German aircraft destroyed, 9 damaged and 1 probable, while losing 3 P-47 seconds. German records indicated 22 aircraft lost across multiple units that day, with 11 pilots killed and 8 wounded. Among those killed was Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, commander of 2.D.2.6 and brother of General Adolf Galland. With 55 victories to his name, he was unable to counter the high-speed diving tactics employed by the P-47 seconds. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th was credited with the probable kill. Diving from altitude at more than 480 mph and striking Galland's Bar-190 with concentrated 50 caliber fire that tore the aircraft apart. Galland's remains were discovered 2 months later, still strapped into his seat, buried deep in the ground from the impact. The loss had a significant psychological effect on the remaining JG-26 pilots, underscoring the growing effectiveness of the P-47 and its new tactical approach. One of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned commanders was brought down by methods he had not anticipated. From a broader operational standpoint, the key outcome was that bomber formations began losing significantly fewer aircraft during periods when P-47 escorts were present. The Thunderbolt had demonstrated that it could effectively shield bombers whose missions were steadily eroding Germany's industrial and military capacity. That protective role, more than individual victory counts, defined real success. High aerial victory totals mattered mainly because they enabled the continuation of strategic bombing operations. By October 1943, P-47 dive attack doctrine had fully matured, producing results that would have seemed unrealistic just half a year earlier. Missions flown that month revealed what disciplined pilots applying refined tactics could accomplish. On 4 October 1943, during an escort operation toward Frankfurt, the 56th Fighter Group encountered roughly 60 German fighters near Cologne attempting to intercept the bomber stream. Using altitude advantage and controlled diving strikes, the American pilots shot down around 15 Bf-110 twin-engine aircraft along with several single-engine fighters, claiming 16 total victories. Only 2 P-47 seconds were lost, both to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy aircraft. 4 days later, on 8 October, Lieutenant Johnson, flying as wingman to Captain Gerald W. Johnson, carried out a textbook high-speed diving attack that raised his personal tally to 4 victories. Cruising at about 29,000 feet over Bremen, he noticed an Fw-190 approaching another P-47 from a blind angle. Rolling inverted, he pulled roughly 4 Gs to align his aircraft, then pushed the engine to maximum emergency power. Diving to about 26,000 feet and accelerating to around 460 mph, he opened fire, .850 caliber machine guns converged on the German fighter, which broke apart and fell in a spin. Johnson immediately converted his speed back into altitude, climbing several thousand feet in under half a minute and rejoining his formation within a minute. The entire sequence from initial roll to altitude recovery lasted under a minute and illustrated the classic boom and zoom method executed precisely. 2 days later, on 10 October 1943, Johnson reached ace status during a major engagement over Munster. His squadron intercepted about 40 German fighters attempting to attack withdrawing B-17 bombers. In a complex and fast-moving battle, Johnson conducted 3 separate dive attacks within roughly 25 minutes. He destroyed a Bf-109, a Bf-110, and an FW-190 escort aircraft, bringing his confirmed victories to 5. One of those kills, unknown to him at the time, was the highly experienced German commander Hans Philipp, who had amassed 206 victories. Johnson would not learn this until decades later when researchers compared wartime records. His aggressive approach came at a cost. During his final pass, defensive fire from a Bf-110 struck his P-47. Cannon shells tore through the right wing and fuselage, damaging hydraulics and control surfaces. Smoke and fluid loss followed quickly. Johnson turned toward England in what became a tense and extended return flight. German fighters spotted the damaged aircraft and attempted to finish it off on 3 occasions. Each time, Johnson pushed the Thunderbolt into a steep dive, building speed above 400 mph despite heavy vibration and impaired controls, allowing him to escape pursuit. Even in a crippled state, the P-47 could still outdive its adversaries. He nursed the aircraft across Belgium and over the English Channel while gradually losing altitude. Eventually, he located an emergency landing strip and managed a careful landing despite limited visibility and severely reduced control responsiveness. Ground crews later counted more than 200 bullet and cannon strikes. Structural members in the right wing were severed, and the fuselage showed deep damage to critical systems. Yet the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine had continued running with minimal cylinder loss, and the rugged airframe held together. Johnson emerged without serious injury, and after extensive repairs the aircraft returned to service. The October 1943 missions demonstrated not only the effectiveness of diving attack doctrine, but also the Thunderbolt's resilience. The P-47 combined high-speed offensive capability with exceptional durability and redundant systems. Pilots could attack assertively, confident that even if hit, the aircraft often had the strength to bring them home. That confidence encouraged bolder tactics and improved mission outcomes. By November 1943, the 56 fighter group's approach was being adopted throughout the 8th Air Force. P-47 units were trained to think in vertical terms. Altitude equaled safety, speed ensured survival, and discipline produced victory. Pilots were instructed not to descend to an enemy's altitude unless bomber protection required it, to favor diving attacks over turning engagements, and to avoid fair fights when they could strike from advantage. Statistics from mid-1943 reflected the effectiveness of these methods. From June through December, once tactics were refined and pilots gained experience, the 56th Fighter Group achieved kill-to-loss ratios nearing 11:1 when, counting only aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, including all operational losses, mechanical issues, weather, and ground fire, the ratio still exceeded 5:1. In engagements where pilots maintained altitude discipline and adhered strictly to dive attack doctrine, ratios surpassed 15:1 and sometimes approached 20:1 under favorable conditions. These results were rooted in physics as much as tactics. A P-47 cruising at 30,000 feet possessed enormous potential energy. Diving to 20,000 feet converted that energy into speed approaching or exceeding 500 mph velocities German fighters could not safely match. The FA-190 faced structural limits around 450 mph in a dive, while the Bf-109 struggled with control at similar speeds. After making a firing pass near 20,000 feet, a P-47 pilot could pull several Gs and use accumulated speed to climb back toward 28,000 or 29,000 feet. Mastery of altitude, speed, and timing made the Thunderbolt a formidable escort fighter and ensured the continued effectiveness of the Allied bombing campaign. The typical engagement profile began high above the bomber formations. From roughly 30,000 feet, a P-47 could dive to about 20,000 feet, attack, and climb back to around 28,000 in well under a minute and a half, all while burning relatively little fuel. By contrast, a German interceptor trying to climb from 20,000 to 30,000 feet needed several minutes and used far more fuel, and its engine performance steadily deteriorated as altitude increased. This disparity in performance gradually affected German pilot morale. By late 1943 and early 1944, Luftwaffe combat reports frequently noted a reluctance to engage Thunderbolts at altitudes above 25,000 feet. Some units avoided climbing altogether, choosing instead to attack bomber formations during ascent or descent, when American escort fighters were less dominant. However, this approach forced German pilots into heavier defensive fire from bombers and reduced the effectiveness of their attacks. Insights from experienced German commanders later confirmed this shift in thinking. Interviews conducted after the war revealed that seasoned Luftwaffe pilots came to view the P-47 as particularly dangerous whenever it held the altitude advantage. Meanwhile, American pilots refined their tactics. They resisted descending to lower altitudes where German fighters had better turning ability and acceleration. Instead, they launched repeated high-speed dives from above, firing brief bursts and climbing away before an effective counterattack could be organized. If German fighters attempted to climb to intercept, the Thunderbolts simply climbed higher, relying on superior high-altitude engine performance. The only workable response for German units was to strike bombers quickly from below and withdraw before the American escorts could dive on them. This reduced aiming time and made them more vulnerable to bomber gunners. Despite such efforts, the imbalance in high-altitude combat persisted. Executing these diving attacks demanded exceptional stamina and technique. Recovering from dives exceeding 500 mPh could subject pilots to forces greater than 7 times gravity. Blood shifted away from the brain, vision narrowed, and some aviators briefly blacked out at the bottom of their dives. To counter these effects, P-47 pilots adopted anti-G techniques similar to those used by dive bomber crews, tightening leg and abdominal muscles, forcing air pressure through breathing and vocalization, and limiting recovery to about 6.5 G when possible. Even so, repeated missions took a physical toll. Pilots often returned to base exhausted, suffering from eye strain, back pain, and general fatigue from constant high-G maneuvering. As the bombing campaign intensified during the winter of 1943-44, missions penetrated deeper into German territory. On January 11, 1944, a major escort operation encountered more than 100 German fighters. The resulting engagement lasted nearly an hour and stretched across roughly 150 miles. Major Francis Gabreski led formations from high altitude and conducted multiple diving attacks, destroying several enemy aircraft and damaging others. That day, his group claimed over 20 German fighters destroyed while losing only a handful of P-47 seconds. More importantly, bomber losses remained far lower than expected, underscoring the value of effective escort tactics. February 1944 saw the launch of Operation Argument, Big Week, a concentrated series of raids against German aircraft production. American bomber forces flew thousands of sorties, and German defenses responded with maximum effort. During this period and the weeks that followed, the 56th Fighter Group accumulated extensive combat time and inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe. Experienced American pilots, now well-versed in high-altitude diving tactics, faced German replacements with far less training. Many German pilots had fewer than 50 hours in their operational aircraft, while American pilots often arrived with 3 or 4 times that experience. These inexperienced crews were especially vulnerable to surprise attacks from above and frequently reacted by diving away exactly the situation the P-47 was built to exploit. By March 1944, the Allies had largely secured daylight air superiority over Germany. German fighters still appeared, but in reduced numbers and with less aggressive behavior. On one escort to Berlin that month, American fighters completed the mission without a single high-altitude interception. Experience had shown German units that engaging Thunderbolts at altitude carried severe risks. As resistance in the air diminished, P-47 units increasingly shifted to fighter-bomber roles. They carried bombs and rockets to attack rail yards, convoys, and industrial targets. Even in this role, the aircraft's diving capability remained central. Pilots orbited at high altitude, spotted targets, descended steeply, released weapons at medium altitude, and climbed back out before anti-aircraft gunners could respond effectively. The same characteristics that made the Thunderbolt formidable in air combat: speed in a dive, rugged construction, and strong high-altitude performance made it equally effective in ground attack. Several American aces built their records using these methods. Francis Gabreski finished with 28 confirmed victories in the European theater, all in P-47 seconds. Robert Johnson achieved 27 victories before returning home in 1944 to train new pilots and support war bond drives. Other pilots, such as David Schilling, also accumulated high scores in the aircraft. Many later credited disciplined adherence to tactical doctrine as more decisive than individual flying brilliance. Correct use of an aircraft's strengths, they argued, could allow an average pilot to defeat a more skilled opponent who relied on unsuitable tactics. The overall record of the 56th Fighter Group illustrated the effectiveness of this approach. Between 1943 and 1945, the unit flew hundreds of missions and claimed more aerial victories than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force. Losses to enemy fighters were comparatively low, producing a favorable exchange ratio. Even when all operational losses were included, their results demonstrated the strategic value of maintaining escort protection for bomber formations. Each intercepted German fighter reduced the threat to Allied bombers. Each protected bomber crew increased the likelihood that targets would be struck and missions completed. In this way, the combination of high-altitude escort fighters and disciplined tactics contributed significantly to the eventual success of the strategic bombing campaign over Germany. Walker Mahurin recorded 21 aerial victories while serving with the 56th Fighter Group before moving on to other assignments. Like many leading American fighter pilots of the time, he attributed his success to steep, high-speed diving attacks, tactics first encouraged by Zemke's leadership and perfected through extensive combat experience. Across multiple fronts, the P-47 Thunderbolt proved that attacking from altitude and preserving energy gave pilots a decisive edge. During the Second World War, Thunderbolts flew more than 746,000 sorties in a wide range of missions. Overall, the aircraft achieved a kill ratio of roughly 4.6 enemy planes destroyed for every P-47 lost, with 3,499 Thunderbolts destroyed from all combat causes. These aggregate figures, however, concealed large differences among units and theaters. Squadrons that consistently applied high-altitude diving doctrine often achieved ratios from 8:1 up to 15:1. By contrast, groups that strayed from these methods or operated mostly at low altitude where the aircraft's weaknesses became apparent saw far less favorable results. The engineering behind the Thunderbolt made such tactics possible. Designed under Alexander Kartveli at Republic Aviation, the widely used P-47D model had a wingspan just over 40 feet, a length of 36 feet 1 inch, and stood nearly 15 feet tall. Depending on external fuel tanks and weapons, its combat weight ranged from about 14,000 to 17,500 pounds. Top speed reached approximately 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. Initial climb rate was around 2,700 feet per minute at sea level and improved at higher altitudes thanks to the aircraft's turbocharged engine. The service ceiling extended to roughly 42,000 feet, and with drop tanks it could escort bombers about 460 miles far enough to reach deep into Germany. Its armament consisted of 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, each supplied with 425 rounds, for a total of 3,400 rounds. Continuous firing could last about half a minute, though pilots usually fired short bursts lasting 1 to 3 seconds, allowing for multiple engagements. The heavy, .50 caliber ammunition, weighing around 1.7 ounces per round and often using armor-piercing incendiary designs, could penetrate airframes, damage engines, ignite fuel, and incapacitate pilots from distances beyond 500 yards. Power came from the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, an 18-cylinder radial with a displacement of roughly 2,884 cubic inches. At standard rating, it produced about 2,000 horsepower at 2,700 RPM. When water methanol injection was used for emergency power, output could reach 2,300 horsepower for brief periods. This drove a massive 4-blade Curtiss propeller over 12 feet in diameter. At high speed, the propeller tips approached the speed of sound, creating vibrations and noise that warned pilots they were nearing compressibility limits. Perhaps the most advanced feature of the aircraft was its turbo supercharger system. A General Electric B-series turbo unit mounted in the rear fuselage used exhaust from all cylinders to spin a turbine at more than 21,000 RPM. This turbine powered a compressor that forced dense air into the engine even at high altitude. The air passed through an intercooler before final compression, allowing the engine to maintain full rated power up to around 27,000 feet, far higher than most non-turbocharged engines of the era. Structurally, the P-47 was exceptionally rugged. Its main wing spar could tolerate more than 8 G of positive load and about 3.5 G negative. The fuselage framework was designed to absorb crash forces that might otherwise kill the pilot. Armor protection included an armored headrest, heavy plating behind the seat, protective armor around engine components, and bullet-resistant windscreen glass. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered materials that swelled when punctured, reducing the risk of catastrophic fuel loss. Together, these characteristics created a fighter ideally suited to high-altitude energy tactics. The Thunderbolt could climb to altitude, dive at extreme speed onto an opponent, deliver a short burst of fire, and then zoom back upward to safety. Pilots could repeat this cycle until ammunition or fuel ran low. German fighter pilots trying to counter this approach faced difficult options: climb to meet the Americans where the P-47 performed best, attempt to lure them downward often unsuccessfully, or avoid combat entirely and concede control of the skies. These methods had effects beyond individual dogfights. By 1944, mounting losses among German pilots caused in part by Thunderbolts and other Allied fighters strained training programs that could not replace experienced airmen quickly enough. New pilots entered combat with limited preparation and became vulnerable to disciplined American formations. Over time, US pilots accumulated more flight hours and combat experience than their German counterparts. This widening gap, combined with strong high-altitude performance and effective tactics, created an increasingly untenable situation for the Luftwaffe. Allied strategic bombing operations targeted oil facilities, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks throughout Germany. These campaigns depended on fighter escorts securing air superiority, and the Thunderbolt played a major role in that success. The effectiveness of altitude-based diving attacks helped ensure that Allied bombers could operate with reduced interference, contributing significantly to victory in Europe. After the war, analysts concluded that energy-focused boom and zoom tactics were generally more effective than traditional turning dogfights when opponents were evenly matched. This insight influenced post-war fighter development. Early jet aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre and later the F-100 Super Sabre prioritized speed, climb performance, and energy management over tight turning ability. Some pilots carried these lessons across generations of aircraft. Francis Gabreski, who had flown P-47 seconds over Europe, later flew F-86 Sabres in Korea. Applying the same principles of altitude advantage and high-speed attacks, he downed 6.5 MiG-15 seconds, becoming one of only a handful of American pilots to earn ace status in 2 wars. The technology had changed, but the tactical logic remained: maintain altitude, dive quickly, strike, then climb away before the enemy could respond. Post-war interviews with German airmen often emphasized the psychological impact of these attacks. Many described the sudden destruction of a nearby aircraft with little warning as American fighters plunged from above at high speed, then disappeared again before retaliation was possible. Facing opponents who controlled altitude and speed left little room for counterattack. For many German pilots, the most they could hope for was that the next diving formation would choose someone else as its target. The aerodynamics behind the high-speed diving attack gave the P-47 an advantage few propeller-driven fighters could rival. Later computer modeling based on authentic performance data confirmed what Thunderbolt pilots had already learned in combat. When P-47 units preserved altitude and relied strictly on dive and zoom engagements, their success rates against comparable German aircraft could surpass 20 victories for every loss. German fighters only gained an edge when Thunderbolt pilots abandoned this approach and allowed themselves to be drawn into low-level turning battles. The conclusion was clear. Combat methods that used an aircraft's real strengths consistently outperformed tactics based on what pilots wished their machines could do. The P-47 was not designed to outturn lighter fighters, nor did it excel at climbing below 20,000 feet. Its range only became competitive in later versions. Yet it possessed unmatched dive speed, exceptional durability, and strong performance at high altitude. When tactics were built around these traits, the results were remarkable. The 56th Fighter Group became a defining example of this principle. They inherited an aircraft widely criticized as too heavy and unwieldy for air combat. Through careful evaluation and repeated testing, they identified what the Thunderbolt actually did best. From there, they created a doctrine that maximized its advantages while limiting situations that exposed its weaknesses. Constant practice turned these methods into reflex. Even under extreme pressure, pilots adhered to the plan. Their discipline contributed to gaining control of the air over Germany and safeguarding thousands of bomber crews who relied on top cover from Thunderbolts diving out of the upper sky. Colonel Hubert Zemke, often rendered Zanker in some accounts, who led the 56th during its formative period, later described the transformation. When he assumed command in late 1942, he faced an aircraft considered unsuitable for its role, and pilots worried about facing seasoned German opponents. His task, as he wrote after the war, was to determine what the P-47 could truly do and design tactics accordingly. The answer centered on the dive. The Thunderbolt could descend faster than its adversaries, recover safely from extreme speeds, and then climb back to altitude to repeat the attack. Once this cycle was mastered, the unit's confidence and effectiveness soared. By the end of the conflict, the P-47 had established itself as one of the most effective fighters of the war. Across roughly 746,000 sorties, it achieved an overall kill ratio around 4.6 to 1. Those figures, however, concealed the higher performance of well-trained groups following strict doctrine. The 56th Fighter Group recorded an 11 to 1 ratio when counting only air-to-air losses, or about 5.3 to 1 when all operational losses were included. Individual pilots who fully embraced the dive attack method achieved extraordinary records. Francis Gabreski scored 28 victories in 166 missions, Robert Johnson 27 in 91. Their results approached 1 victory for every 4 combat sorties. Numbers many air forces considered unsustainable over time. In essence, the Thunderbolt story demonstrates the value of analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, and physical reality over tradition. Early in 1943, prevailing opinion held that heavy fighters could not compete with lighter, more agile opponents. Since the First World War, turning performance and climb rate had defined fighter design and tactics. Most pilots preferred nimble aircraft suited to close-range maneuvering fights. Yet a group of American aviators climbed to roughly 30,000 feet in one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever built, rolled inverted, and discovered that steep. High-speed dives offered a more decisive path to victory than turning contests. They showed that an aircraft's genuine capabilities mattered far more than established beliefs about what fighters were supposed to do. German pilots who faced these methods learned quickly how dangerous they were. American pilots who flew the Thunderbolt learned the same lesson from the other side. Historians examining the air war over Europe cannot ignore how a supposedly inferior fighter gained dominance through tactics that exploited unexpected strengths. The Thunderbolt units adopted vertical attacks because analysis indicated they were effective. They continued using them because combat results confirmed it. Under favorable conditions, victory ratios approached 20-1 because sound tactics rooted in physics proved more decisive than bravery alone or adherence to tradition. Achieving air superiority required identifying real strengths, shaping doctrine around them, training until execution became automatic, and maintaining discipline even when instinct suggested otherwise. High above the battlefield, pilots would roll over, accelerate downward at extreme speed, fire a short, precise burst, and then climb back to safety before the enemy could react. Performed correctly and in coordination with wingmen, the method left opponents with little chance to respond. That was the insight developed by the 56th Fighter Group through months of evaluation, training, and combat. Their approach marked a tactical shift that helped secure control of the skies over Europe. The Thunderbolt's success was not due solely to courage or even to the aircraft itself. It resulted from tactics grounded in physics, executed consistently and with discipline. Together, those elements proved decisive.